A quiet file doesn't mean a quiet truth. Sometimes it just means the right question hasn't been asked yet. For 10 years, one woman's death sat buried in paperwork, neatly labeled, conveniently explained, and almost forgotten. No alarms, no urgency, just another accident lost in the noise of alcohol and arguments. But beneath that calm surface, something was rotting, a detail that didn't fit, a silence that didn't feel right. And when that silence finally cracked, it didn't just expose one mistake, it unraveled an entire chain of deaths that had been hiding in plain sight. What followed wasn't just an investigation, it was the slow awakening of something far more disturbing. The voice on the phone didn't sound emotional. It didn't shake, it didn't hesitate. It just stated something that had been waiting far too long to be said. A decade earlier, a woman had died. The system had stamped it, filed it, and moved on. But now, for the first time, someone was saying out loud what had never been written down. Detective Sergeant Maru Tumanen sat with that silence after the call ended. Not the silence of confusion, but the kind that lingers when something feels wrong in a way you can't ignore. Because this wasn't just a son suspecting his father. This was a witness, a child who had watched, remembered, and carried it quietly for 10 years. The case file he pulled from storage looked exactly how closed cases are supposed to look. Clean, structured, finished. A domestic incident, alcohol involved, no forced entry, no clear sign of intent. The kind of conclusion that makes sense on paper, the kind that doesn't invite further questions. But now, every line felt incomplete. The woman at the center of it all was Ismo Juni, 36 years old when she died in 1980. The location? A modest apartment in the Kuntula district of Helsinki, an area that, at the time, carried a reputation. Alcohol-fueled arguments weren't unusual there. Police were called often, but rarely for anything that didn't resolve itself by morning. When officers first arrived back then, they weren't walking into what looked like a crime scene. They were responding to a death. No chaos, no urgency, just a man waiting. That man was her husband, Ismo Juni. He didn't resist, didn't panic, didn't over-explain. If anything, he seemed neutral. He simply led officers through the apartment, past the quiet kitchen, past the glasses left out from the night before, and toward a small walk-in closet. That's where they found her. Kaya's body lay partially wrapped in a wool carpet, positioned in a way that felt more concealed than discovered. She was half-dressed. Rigor mortis had already set in. But what stood out wasn't just how she was found, it was how little the room around her revealed. No overturned furniture, no obvious struggle, nothing dramatic enough to immediately contradict the story that followed. And the story was simple. They had been drinking. Like many nights before, at some point she went to the bathroom, slipped, hit her head, lost consciousness. A tragic accident. It fit. Too well, maybe, but it fit. The couple was known to drink heavily. Their relationship had a history of tension. Neighbors had heard arguments before, loud ones, but nothing that had ever escalated into formal reports. So when this explanation was presented, it didn't sound impossible. It sounded familiar. Still, procedure demanded an autopsy, and that's where things started to shift. Not enough to break the case, but enough to leave faint cracks that no one followed. The report confirmed head trauma, severe internal bleeding, water in her lungs, indicators that could align with a fall in a bathroom setting. But then there were the details that didn't settle so neatly. Bruising that didn't clearly match a single impact, marks that suggested more than just a collapse, and one detail that stood out immediately, a missing tooth. Not loose, not decayed, not naturally fallen. A healthy upper front tooth, removed with its root intact. Recent. Forceful. When questioned, Ismo had an answer ready. He claimed he had tried to resuscitate her, forced her mouth open. The tooth, he said, must have come loose during that attempt. It wasn't convincing, but it wasn't impossible either. And that's where the investigation stalled. Not because there were no questions, but because there were no answers strong enough to replace the official narrative. Suspicion alone wasn't evidence, and without evidence, there was no case. So the file was closed. Ismo Juni's death became just another entry, another incident explained, processed, and archived. Life, however, didn't pause the way investigations do. The children were removed from the home and sent to live with relatives. The apartment emptied. The noise that once filled it disappeared. And in its place came something quieter, something harder to measure, memory. While the system moved on, one of those children didn't. He carried what he had seen, what he had heard, what he had understood in a way no report ever captured. But as a child, there are things you don't say. Not because they aren't real, but because you don't yet know how to make them matter. Years passed, and during those years, Ismo Juni didn't disappear into suspicion. He didn't become a shadow. He stayed exactly where he had always been. Visible, social, ordinary. He drank. He argued. He lived his life in full view of the same people who had once heard the noise from behind those apartment walls. Some found him unsettling, not because of anything specific, but because of the absence of something expected. Grief didn't quite look right on him. Reactions didn't quite match the situation. But unease isn't evidence either, and so it remained just that, an impression without consequence. There were whispers, of course. Neighbors remembered arguments the night Kaya died. Some recalled screams. Others mentioned the children crying, but none of it had been formally recorded. No statements taken, no follow-up conducted. Those moments existed only as fragments, memories without documentation, and so the gap remained. A missing tooth, a quiet apartment, a man who didn't quite react the way he should have, and a child who had seen something no one had asked him about. By the late 1980s, the case had faded completely. It lived only in files and in the minds of those who had chosen not to revisit it, until the phone rang, and suddenly, everything that had once seemed settled didn't feel that way anymore. When Detective Sergeant Maru Tuominen reopened the file, it didn't explode with new evidence. It did something far more unsettling. It exposed how little had ever been properly examined. The photographs were still there, grainy, black and white, capturing a moment that had been frozen and then forgotten. The autopsy report, the short witness notes. Everything looked complete at first glance. Signed off, closed. But when he looked closer, the absence became obvious. There were no detailed statements from the children, none. The very people who had been inside the apartment that night had never been properly questioned. No recorded interviews, no follow-ups, no attempt to understand what they might have seen or heard. The entire case had been built almost entirely on one version of events, Ismo's, and now that version didn't feel stable anymore. So he arranged to meet the son. Face to face, the man didn't behave like someone chasing revenge or trying to rewrite the past. He was calm, measured. He didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize. He simply described what he remembered, clearly, directly, as if it had never left him. That night his parents had been drinking. That part matched the file. But then the argument started. Not unusual, but different this time. Louder, sharper, escalating. He remembered his mother trying to get away. He remembered her falling or being forced down. And then he remembered something that had never appeared in any report. His father kicking her in the head. Not once, hard. After that, everything went quiet. No ambulance immediately. No panic, no chaos. Just silence. By morning, life moved forward as if nothing had happened. The children were sent to school, and when they returned, they were told their mother was dead. It was a memory that didn't fit inside the word accident. When Detective Tuominen compared this account with the autopsy findings, something clicked into place. The head trauma, the internal bleeding, the bruises that didn't align with a simple fall. They suddenly made more sense. Not as isolated injuries, but as part of an assault. And that tooth, it kept coming back to that. A healthy tooth doesn't just come out during resuscitation. Not like that. Not clean, root intact. It suggested force, deliberate force. Individually, none of it proved murder, but together, it created something far more dangerous than proof. It created doubt. And not the vague kind, the kind that forces you to keep digging. So he started pulling at the edges. The next step led him to the neighbors Ismo had gone to the night of Kaya's death. Isa and her husband, Maddie. If anyone had seen something, felt something, noticed something unusual, it would be them. Isa remembered that night clearly. She had heard the disturbance, loud noises, something hitting, something breaking. Not unusual in that building, but still enough to notice. But what stayed with her wasn't the noise, it was Ismo. When he came to her door asking for help, he didn't look like a man whose wife had just died. He wasn't panicked, wasn't disoriented, wasn't even particularly emotional. He was composed. Too composed, as if he was delivering news, not reacting to it. That detail lingered, because behavior matters, not as proof, but as context. And his didn't match the situation. But Isa's account didn't stop there. She described the dynamic between her husband, Maddie, and Ismo. They weren't just neighbors, they were close. Drinking partners. The kind of relationship built on long nights, alcohol, and repetition. Days blending into each other. And that environment? It wasn't stable. Arguments weren't rare, they were routine. Tension wasn't occasional, it was constant. And Kaya, according to Isa, hadn't always been part of that cycle. She had been pulled into it over time, adapting just to survive inside that space. Then there was something else, jealousy. Isa believed Ismo had grown increasingly suspicious of the relationship between Kaya and Maddie. Not necessarily because of anything real, but because paranoia had started to take hold. And in that kind of environment, suspicion doesn't stay quiet. It turns into accusations, control, violence. She had feared for Kaya long before the night she died. And after her death, things didn't settle. If anything, they became stranger. Ismo started talking about death more openly. Not in a grieving way, but in a way that felt detached. almost fascinated. He spoke about wanting to work in a cemetery morgue. He visited Kaija's grave frequently, but according to Isa, it didn't feel like mourning. It felt performative, like something meant to be seen. And then there were the comments. She recalled him talking about the police investigation, almost mockingly, saying they would never be able to prove anything, saying it with a kind of confidence that didn't sit right. There was even an incident where he threatened his own son while drunk, because the boy hinted he knew more than he should. That alone was enough to shift the entire tone of the case. But then came something even more disturbing. Isa mentioned a small tin container. According to her husband Maddie, Ismo carried it with him, and inside it, he believed there was Kaija's missing tooth. At the time, it sounded bizarre. Unsettling, yes, but impossible to verify. And without evidence, it remained just another detail that didn't go anywhere. But now, with everything else coming into focus, it didn't feel random anymore. It felt like a pattern trying to form. There was just one problem. When Detective Tuominen tried to speak to Maddie himself, the one person who could confirm or deny all of this, he discovered something that shifted the investigation in an entirely new direction. Maddie was dead. And not just dead, he had died years earlier, in a fire that had already been ruled an accident. At first it seemed like a dead end, but the more details emerged, the less accidental it began to feel. Maddie's death had been written off the same way Kaya's had. Quickly, cleanly, and without too many questions. A fire at a summer cottage in Kivinoka, a faulty stove, a tragic accident, case closed. But now, standing in the middle of a reopened investigation, that explanation didn't feel as solid as it once had. According to Isa, the timeline had never quite made sense. Her husband, Matty Harpin, had gone to his cottage in Kivinoka, a quiet coastal allotment area on the edge of Helsinki, where small wooden cabins sat close together, places people used to escape the city, to drink, to disappear for a few days. That was normal for him. What wasn't normal was what came after. The fire that killed him had been ruled accidental, a stove malfunction, no evidence of arson, no signs of forced entry, just another case that fit neatly into a familiar pattern. But Isa didn't believe it, because of something Ismo had said before it happened. One evening, frustrated and exhausted, she had confided in Ismo Juni about her struggles with Maddie, his drinking, his behavior, the tension it created in their home. And instead of offering sympathy or advice, Ismo had grabbed her shoulders and told her, "It'll get easier for you soon." At the time, it sounded vague, maybe even meaningless. After the fire, it didn't. And then there was the part that never made it into any official report. After Maddie died, Ismo told Isa that he had been there at the cottage when the fire started. That detail alone should have changed everything. Because if it were true, it raised immediate questions. Why hadn't he tried to help? Why hadn't he called for emergency services? Why hadn't he been injured? But none of those questions had ever been asked, or at least, not formally. For Detective Sergeant Maru Tuominen, this was no longer about revisiting one suspicious death. It was about recognizing a pattern that had been missed entirely. 2 deaths, both explained away, both connected to the same man, and both containing details that didn't quite fit. So Ismo Juni was brought in for questioning again. At first, nothing had changed. He repeated the same version of events he had given 10 years earlier, the same structure, the same calm delivery, drinking, accident, panic, attempt to help. It was almost rehearsed. But this time, the questions were different. This time, investigators weren't looking to confirm his story. They were testing it. They pressed him on the injuries, on the bruising that didn't match a fall, on the water found in Kaya's lungs, on the missing tooth, on the account given by his son. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the story began to shift, not all at once, piece by piece. At first, he adjusted small details, suggested that maybe Kaya had tried to harm herself, that maybe she had slipped in a different way than he originally described. But inconsistencies started piling up, so he changed direction. He admitted that he had held her head underwater, but only, he claimed, to calm her down, not to hurt her. It didn't hold. The pressure increased. And eventually, the structure of his original story collapsed entirely. He admitted that the argument had turned violent, that he had hit her, kicked her, thrown her against furniture, that the injuries weren't from a fall, they were from him. By that point, the line between accident and assault had already been crossed. There was no going back to the original version. No way to reframe it as something unintended. But what came next went far beyond anything the investigators had expected. Because instead of stopping there, instead of limiting his confession to violence, he kept talking. He described moving her body into the walk-in closet. He described attempting to engage in sexual acts with her while she was unconscious. And when that failed, he admitted to sexually assaulting her using a toilet plunger, the same object that had been recorded at the scene years earlier, but never treated as significant. It was no longer a case of overlooked evidence. It was a case of misunderstood brutality. And then came the detail that tied everything together in the most disturbing way possible. The tooth. He admitted that he had removed it himself, not accidentally, not during resuscitation, deliberately. He claimed he did it to check if she was still alive, but by that point, intent didn't matter anymore. The act itself spoke louder than any explanation he could offer. He never used the word murder. He didn't need to. There was no other way to interpret what he had just described. Ismo Juni's death was no longer an accident. It was a violent assault followed by actions that crossed into something far darker, something calculated, something controlled. And if that had been hidden for 10 years, then the question became unavoidable. What else had been missed? So investigators turned back to Maddie's death. And just like before, Ismo started with denial. He placed himself nowhere near the cottage that night, claimed no involvement, no knowledge. But the pattern was already clear. As soon as he was confronted with inconsistencies, with Issa's statement, with timelines, with the gaps in his story, he adjusted again. Admitted he had seen Maddie earlier that day, then admitted he had been at the cabin, and finally, he confessed. The two men had been drinking together, as usual. And like so many times before, an argument broke out. Something trivial, something small. But with Ismo, small things didn't stay small. During the confrontation, he struck Maddie with a glass vase, hard enough to cause serious injury. Hard enough that one of Maddie's teeth broke through his lip. And then, just like with Kaya, he removed it, kept it, placed it in the same container, the same pattern, the same behavior, repeated. Maddie wasn't dead at that point, just unconscious. But instead of helping him, Ismo watched. A candle had been knocked over during the struggle. The fire started unintentionally, but what happened next wasn't accidental. He let it spread, then he helped it. He poured flammable liquid around the cabin, ensuring the fire would take hold, ensuring it wouldn't be contained. And then he left, but not before escalating it further. As he exited, he picked up a burning object and threw it at a neighboring cabin, igniting a second fire. Only then did he step back, sit down, and watch. Maddie and his dog were still inside, alive when the fire began, trapped as it spread. By the time investigators revisited the original case files, the details lined up in ways they hadn't before. The damage to the neighboring cabin, once attributed to heat transfer, now suggested something more direct. The autopsy confirmed smoke inhalation, meaning Maddie had been alive when the fire started. And Ismo's description of the cabin, the layout, the objects inside, the sequence of events, matched perfectly with photographs taken years earlier. Details he couldn't have known unless he had been there. What had once been labeled an accident was now something else entirely. A second murder, and more importantly, part of a pattern. Because by this point, it was becoming impossible to ignore what was forming. Violence, fire, control, and the same disturbing detail repeating itself. Teeth, taken, kept, remembered. This wasn't random, it was methodical, and it wasn't over. By the time investigators finished mapping everything out, the pattern was no longer subtle, it was undeniable. What had once been isolated incidents, an accidental death in an apartment, a fire at a quiet cottage, a series of unrelated blazes in Kivinoka, were now connected by one constant: Ismo Juni. And once he started talking, the scale of it expanded far beyond what anyone had expected. The fires in Kivinoka weren't random. They weren't faulty stoves or careless accidents fueled by alcohol. They were deliberate, controlled, repeated. In one case, two men, Seppo Mentinen and Juha Havari, had been drinking with Ismo before he intentionally provoked an argument, waited for them to pass out, and then returned to set the cabin on fire. He used a candle, then reinforced it with lamp oil. He stayed close enough to watch. In another, a man named Pauli Sarin was targeted in almost the exact same way. A conversation, alcohol, a staged conflict, then fire. Each time the method remained consistent, not just in execution but in mindset. Isolation, vulnerability, control. And once again, the same disturbing detail lingered in the background. The removal of teeth, not always confirmed, but heavily suspected. A ritual, a signature, something taken, not for necessity, but for memory. By now, the media had a name for him, the Tooth Killer. And while the nickname itself felt almost crude compared to the brutality behind it, it captured the one detail no one could ignore. When police searched his apartment in 1991, they didn't just find evidence tied to known victims. They found something else. A denture. It didn't belong to him. It didn't belong to his wife. It didn't belong to any of the identified victims. And to this day, no one knows where it came from, which raises the question investigators couldn't fully answer. Were there more? Because every confirmed victim had only been connected to Ismo after someone forced the system to look again. None of the cases had originally pointed to him. None had been treated as homicides at first. He hadn't been caught because he made a mistake. He had been caught because someone broke the silence. In court, Ismo tried to pull back, claimed exaggeration, suggested he had been influenced during questioning, but the details he provided, specific, verifiable, impossible to fabricate, left little room for doubt. In 1992, he was convicted. Multiple murders, arson, assault, a life sentence. But even that didn't last. In 1995, just 3 years into his imprisonment, Ismo Juni died following complications from heart surgery. He was 52 years old. And just like that, the man at the center of it all was gone. No long-term punishment, no decades behind bars, no slow accountability for what he had done. Only the truth left behind. And that truth started with a single decision, a phone call. Because without it, Kaya Juni's death would still be an accident on paper. The fires in Kivinoka would still sit in separate files. 5 deaths, at least, would remain unconnected, unexplained, and quietly buried. Instead, they became one story. A story not of how a killer was caught, but how he was missed. For years. Not because he was invisible, but because he blended in. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He lived openly, drinking, socializing, existing in the same spaces as everyone else. The danger wasn't hidden in darkness. It was hidden in normality. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all, because nothing changed until someone finally spoke. If this case stayed with you, the details, the pattern, the way it all unfolded, make sure you like the video and subscribe for more deep dives like this. And I want to ask you something. Do you think Ismo would have ever been caught if that phone call never happened? Or would all of this have remained buried forever? Let me know what you think in the comments.